Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Let me ask you something. Was the Great Depression inevitable, or did we unknowingly engineer it through fear, inaction, and a few disastrous decisions? The 1929 stock market crash is often portrayed as the singular catastrophe that plunged the nation into darkness, but that's a shallow reading. Yes, it triggered panic. People were terrified. Banks failed. Prices fell. But panic was just the spark. The fuel that fed the fire came later, through a series of policy missteps and monetary mistakes that deepened and prolonged the suffering. One of the most overlooked culprits, the Federal Reserve. Instead of expanding the money supply when credit was drying up and banks were collapsing, the Fed tightened. It let the system contract. Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff, and instead of being pulled back, you're given a shove. That's what the Fed did. Their refusal to act turned a financial crisis into a nationwide economic paralysis. And then there was President Hoover. His intentions may have been earnest, but the policies weren't. Tariffs like Smoot-Hawley throttled international trade at the worst possible time, making imported goods more expensive and inviting retaliation. On top of that, wage mandates and price controls distorted natural market corrections, slamming the brakes on any chance of recovery. Hoover, in trying to hold the economy steady, accidentally froze it in place. Here's what most people miss. The economic structure of the United States wasn't destroyed. It was still there, intact, but it had been paralyzed by bad policy, fear, and central inaction. It was like a powerful machine with its gears locked, not broken, just jammed. So the question becomes, if the machine wasn't broken, why did it stay idle for so long? That's what we'll uncover in the slides ahead. By 1933, America was desperate. Banks had collapsed. Unemployment was widespread. Breadlines stretched across cities. And in walked Franklin Delano Roosevelt, with promises, power, and policy. His first 100 days in office were a legislative whirlwind. An alphabet soup of agencies poured out of Washington, the NRA, the AAA, the CCC, and the TVA. It was a bold attempt to centralize control and resuscitate the economy from above. And for many, it looked like salvation. But pause for a moment. When a government acts this fast, this aggressively, what else gets swept away? The Emergency Banking Act is a perfect example. Overnight, private banking operations were suspended. Power over the financial system was handed to the executive branch. The move was legally murky, justified as a response to crisis, but its long-term implications, far-reaching. This wasn't just emergency management. It was a redrawing of the lines between private enterprise and government command. And not everyone was on board. The Supreme Court pushed back. Again and again, it ruled New Deal laws unconstitutional. That is, until the so-called switch in time that saved 9. Under mounting political pressure, the court changed course. Not because the Constitution changed, but because the political winds did. And this is where things get even more complicated. Some of these policies blurred the line between recovery and something more authoritarian. Central planning became the norm. Federal power expanded in ways never seen before in peacetime America. The executive branch began to look a lot more like the center of all economic life. So ask yourself, was this a cure, or just a new kind of control? Let's talk about planned chaos. That might sound like a contradiction, but during the New Deal, it became a reality. You see, when the government tried to force economic order through sweeping mandates, what it often produced instead was a tangle of distortions that made things worse. Take the National Industrial Recovery Act. On paper, it was supposed to jumpstart business by stabilizing prices and wages. In practice, it mandated price fixing across entire industries. That might sound tidy, but it meant businesses couldn't adjust to real market conditions. If your costs changed, too bad. If innovation could lower prices, sorry, not allowed. Competition was smothered, and flexibility was crushed. And when you stifle competition, you don't just slow recovery, you kill the spark of progress. Now, let's zoom in on agriculture. Under the AAA, farmers were actually paid to destroy crops. At a time when millions were hungry, when families couldn't afford bread or milk, food was deliberately taken out of circulation to raise prices. This wasn't an unfortunate side effect. It was the plan. Create artificial scarcity to protect farm incomes. But think about that, destroying abundance to simulate prosperity. That's not economics, it's alchemy. All of this had consequences beyond just dollars and cents. When government stepped into direct production and pricing, market signals were scrambled. Producers didn't respond to real supply and demand. They responded to bureaucrats. The result? Resources were misallocated, recovery delayed, and innovation stalled. And who benefited? Often, the politically connected. Protectionist policies and subsidies entrenched monopolies, locking out smaller competitors and cementing advantage where power, not productivity, ruled. What was meant to be a lifeline became a leash. What looked like order was really disorder in disguise. By the mid-1930s, something deeper than economic recovery was underway. It wasn't just about jobs or food or banking. It was about the transformation of the American citizen from a self-reliant individual to a dependent of the federal government. Let's start with the Works Progress Administration. It created millions of jobs, roads, bridges, public buildings. It was infrastructure on a massive scale. But those jobs came with a string attached: dependence. Livelihoods were now tied to government funding and direction. Your paycheck? It came from Washington. And with that shift came a subtle but powerful change in who held the reins of personal autonomy. Then came Social Security. Introduced in 1935, it was hailed as a breakthrough in economic security. And for many, it was. But it also marked the institutionalization of long-term financial dependence. What began as a safety net quickly became a permanent fixture, a new baseline expectation that the federal government would provide not just emergency help, but lifelong support. This wasn't just economics. It was identity. The American model, once built on independence and voluntary cooperation, began to morph into something else. A managed society. Citizens weren't just voters or workers anymore. They were beneficiaries, participants in a vast apparatus of federal oversight. And here's the political twist: as federal aid expanded, so did the incentive to use it as a tool. Jobs, grants, subsidies, these became instruments of political loyalty. Programs weren't just economic tools, they became levers in a growing system of patronage. In short, the government stopped just reacting to crisis and started reshaping the very terms of social life. Not all at once, not with brute force, but gradually, systematically, by design. Here's a part of the story that rarely makes it into textbooks: the recovery that didn't come from Washington. While federal agencies were busy orchestrating top-down programs, something else was happening below the surface. In towns, cities, and small businesses across the country, recovery was being driven by something much older than bureaucracy: capital and confidence. Private capital didn't disappear during the Depression. It adapted. It moved into sectors the government couldn't touch or didn't yet control. Small businesses, regional trade networks, local lending circles, all of these flourished in pockets where innovation was still allowed to breathe. People didn't wait for permission. They found ways to make things work. And guess what? Many of the greatest productivity gains of the decade didn't come from federal initiatives. They came from inventors, entrepreneurs, and engineers quietly improving efficiency. Think of new manufacturing methods, improved logistics, early automation. These weren't headline-grabbing programs, but they were real, and they mattered. What fueled it? Confidence, not in government mandates, but in voluntary cooperation, in the belief that value could still be created, even in a struggling economy. That trust, between individuals, businesses, and local communities, became a kind of economic lifeblood that flowed outside the control of the New Deal apparatus. It's a reminder that resilience doesn't always come from the top. Sometimes, it comes from people refusing to give up, refusing to outsource their hope to central planners. The forgotten recovery wasn't loud, it wasn't choreographed, but it was there. And it tells us something important: that free initiative and decentralized strength never fully disappeared. They just operated in the shadows, waiting for their moment to shine again. Now let's zoom out. It's easy to focus on numbers, on jobs created, GDP shifts, or program budgets. But history isn't just about economics. It's about trade-offs. And one of the biggest trade-offs in the New Deal era was moral. Security versus freedom. The New Deal promised protection against unemployment, poverty, uncertainty, and for millions of Americans, it delivered real relief. But nothing is free. The price wasn't just paid in taxes or inflation. It was paid in autonomy, in responsibility, in the quiet erosion of agency. Top-down programs didn't just direct markets, they redirected lives. When the government takes on more responsibility, individuals tend to take on less. And over time, that changes a culture. The ethic of self-reliance gives way to expectation. Civic duty becomes compliance. Community bonds are replaced by bureaucratic rules. And here's the hard part: once that shift begins, it rarely reverses. Central planning has a way of expanding itself. Each new crisis becomes a justification for more intervention. And the more we seek security from above, the more we surrender control from within. This isn't abstract. Think of Friedrich Hayek's warning that central planning, even when well-intentioned, can quietly lead us down a road where choice narrows, freedom contracts, and the state becomes the final arbiter of opportunity. So we have to ask, not just what the New Deal built, but what it slowly replaced. Did it strengthen the nation by offering support, or weaken it by shifting the moral burden away from individuals and communities? Was this progress, or just a different kind of dependence dressed in the language of justice? Let's talk legacy. Ask most people what ended the Great Depression, and you'll hear the same answer: the New Deal. But that's not what the numbers say. Unemployment remained stubbornly high through the entire decade. It wasn't until World War II, when industrial production surged and labor was drafted into military service, that the economy finally roared back. So why does the myth persist? Because the New Deal didn't just reshape policy, it reshaped narrative. It told a story of bold government saving a helpless nation. And that story stuck. But in reality, much of what the New Deal promised didn't materialize until war spending forced the economy into overdrive. Recovery didn't come from price controls or alphabet agencies, it came from mobilization, sacrifice, and production on a scale never seen before. But here's the part we rarely examine: the powers created for that emergencies never really went away. Programs meant to be temporary became permanent. Departments grew, budgets expanded, and each new generation of leaders inherited tools built not for freedom, but for management. The result? A federal government that became the default problem solver for everything: economic slumps, social unrest, even personal hardship. Crisis, once rare, became institutionalized, and with every new challenge came more justification for centralized solutions. So what are the lessons? That emergencies are dangerous breeding grounds for permanent change. That temporary controls often outlive the crisis they were meant to solve. And that when we turn to government as the first answer, we risk forgetting how often it's been part of the problem. So now we arrive at the part history books tend to skip. The New Deal is often taught as a triumph of compassion, of government stepping in when markets failed. But buried beneath that heroic narrative are deeper questions, questions about power, about freedom, about the long-term consequences of central control. What gets left out? The moral roots of free markets, the civic bonds that once held communities together without federal intervention, the way local solutions, voluntary associations, and entrepreneurial resilience quietly carried on, even as Washington expanded its grip. We rarely hear about the unintended outcomes: the small businesses that were crushed by regulation, the farmers who had to burn crops to qualify for aid, the innovation that was stifled by mandates designed to create order, all in the name of a better tomorrow. History is complex. The New Deal wasn't pure failure, but it wasn't the miracle it's often portrayed as either. It was a pivot, a redefinition of what government should be, and what citizens should expect from it. And those expectations? They are still with us. If this video made you think, if it challenged what you've always been told, then stick around. There's more to uncover, more myths to question, and more stories history tried to bury. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. And if you want to go even deeper, check out my book History They Tried to Erase. The link is in the description. This is Truth Behind History, and we're just getting started.